The year is 911. The place is a riverbank at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, in the kingdom the Franks call West Francia. On one side stands Charles III, King of the Franks, a man history remembers, not kindly, as Charles the Simple. On the other side stands a Norse warlord named Rollo, fresh off a siege of Chartres, with no crown, no castle, and an army the king cannot afford to keep fighting. They are here to make peace. Rollo kneels. He places his hands between the king's hands, the same gesture, more or less, that will bind a French vassal to his lord for the next 500 years. Charles grants him land, the country along the lower Seine, soon to be called Normandy. In exchange, Rollo is supposed to become the king's man. In every sense, the Franks understand that phrase, starting with a final gesture of submission. He is supposed to bend down and kiss the king's foot. He doesn't. According to the story, Rollo has one of his own men do it instead, and rather than kneel, the man simply grabs the king's foot and hauls it up to his mouth, tipping Charles clean over onto his back in front of his own court, which, if the moment happened the way it's described, is a genuinely unhinged way to open 5 centuries of Norman history. I want to flag something before we go further, because this channel doesn't get to have it both ways, cinematic and honest. That scene comes from a single source, a monk named Dudo of Saint-Quentin, writing roughly a century after the fact, on commission from Rollo's own great-grandsons, who very much wanted their ancestor remembered as a man who bent for no one. No treaty document from 911 survives. The earliest hard evidence we have is a royal charter from 918, 7 years later, that mentions the arrangement in passing. So take the foot kissing as legend, not verified fact, but it's the useful kind of legend. It captures something completely real about what was actually happening at that river, underneath the ritual. This is not a story about a treaty. This is not a story about a king losing his balance in front of his own bishops. This is not, really, even a story about Rollo. This is a story about 2 entirely different ideas of what makes a man noble. One built in the halls of Scandinavia, one built in the law courts of Francia, and what happened the moment one of them was forced to kneel inside the other. Keep that image in your head, the king on the ground, the Viking still standing over him, because almost everything in the next 20-some minutes is going to explain exactly why that scene was less absurd and far more inevitable than it looks. To understand why Rollo stayed standing, you have to understand what noble meant where he came from, and it wasn't what Charles's court meant by it. Rollo wasn't born a duke-in-waiting. He wasn't born into a system with dukes at all. Sources disagree on whether he came from Norway or Denmark, and the disagreement itself tells you something. Back home, geography mattered less than reputation. What Rollo was, before any of this, was a chieftain. In Old Norse, a Jarl. And a Jarl wasn't a rank you inherited the way a Frankish count inherited a county. A Jarl was a man other men chose to follow. There's a myth the Norse told about exactly this, an Eddic poem called the Rigsthula. In it, a wandering god fathers 3 sons on 3 different households, and each son becomes the ancestor of a class. The lowest born becomes thrall, father of the enslaved. The middle son becomes carl, father of free farmers, and the wealthiest, most favored son becomes jarl, taught the runes, married well, his own youngest son destined to be a king. It's a just-so story, obviously. Somebody with power always finds a myth to explain why they deserve it. But notice what the poem uses to mark Jarl as different from Carl. Not land, not a title handed down from a monarch. Wealth, favor, and the loyalty he could command. Notice, too, what the story leaves silent. Nobody sings Thrall's fortune. In Norse law, a free man's worth was measured out precisely. A fine owed to his family if he was killed, scaled to his rank. Jarl worth more than Carl. A thrall had no such price at all, because a thrall wasn't a legal person to injure in the first place, just property to be replaced. Whatever loyalty and gift-giving looked like from a Jarl's high seat, it was standing on that. Here's what most people get wrong about the word Jarl. The first time they hear it translated as Earl or Duke, those are the same word, Earl, Jarl. They share a root all the way back to a Proto-Norse term, Erilaz, carved onto stones before the Viking Age even properly begins. Same word, not the same job. And the reason it's not the same job goes back further than either Vikings or Franks. Almost 900 years before Rollo knelt at that riverbank, a Roman historian named Tacitus wrote about the Germanic tribes north of the empire, and he described something he called the comitatus, a war band bound to its leader by oath, not by land. The leader fed his men, armed them, led them into battle. In return, they fought for him, and it was a lifelong disgrace to walk off that battlefield if he didn't. That bond, earned, personal, renewed constantly, is the common ancestor of both systems you're about to watch collide. Scandinavia kept it close to that original shape for centuries. Francia didn't. So when Rollo knelt at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, he wasn't just meeting a foreign king. He was meeting a 500-year-old cousin of his own culture's oldest idea, grown up, formalized, put into writing, and turned into something almost unrecognizable. Watch what each side did with the same starting material. It's not a small divergence. By the time you get to the end of this, you'll understand why one of them nearly broke trying to hold on to the other's throne. Start in the north, since that's where Rollo actually came from. Picture a Norwegian Jarl doing his job on an ordinary year, and the picture gets specific fast, because a chronicler named Snorri Sturluson wrote down the arithmetic of it. According to the Heimskringla, a king appointed one Jarl to each province, and that Jarl gave judgments at law, collected the taxes, and kept a third of them for his own household. Underneath him sat 4 or more Hersir, district commanders, each pulling in a revenue of 20 marks, each owing the king 20 fighting men. The Jarl himself owed 60. Run the math, and a single province's entire military obligation comes down to a short chain of named men, each one accountable to the man directly above him, none of it written into a deed anywhere. It lived in memory, in reputation, in who showed up when called. And what actually held that chain together wasn't law. It was the whole. Here's how the historian Anders Winroth describes it, and it's worth sitting with. Viking raids began in feasting halls, in the loyalties and friendships built over drinking and eating and gift-giving, and they ended the same way, with the plunder handed back out as gifts, which is what set up the next year's raid. A Jarl's silver wasn't wealth he sat on. It was wealth he had to keep moving, constantly, outward, into the hands of the men who fought for him, because the moment he stopped, so did their reason to stay. That's the part that doesn't survive translation when someone calls a Jarl a duke. A duke's authority is attached to land, confirmed by a king's charter, defensible in a court, inheritable whether the duke himself is competent or not. A Jarl's authority was attached to him, his generosity, his luck in a raid, his standing at the thing, the great outdoor assembly where free men gathered to settle law, hear disputes, and, not incidentally, watch each other's status get performed in public. It could run for days, sometimes weeks. Less a courtroom than a recurring public referendum on who currently mattered. Iceland pushed that logic to its limit. No king, no Jarl, ever. Just the Althing, an assembly of the island's 36 district leaders, serving as its only central authority for centuries. If you want proof that Norse legitimacy could run on assembly and reputation alone, with nobody sitting permanently on top of it, that's the proof. So here's the misconception I want to name directly. Because if you've played a video game or watched a prestige drama with Jarl in the subtitles, you've probably absorbed it without noticing. That a Jarl was just the Norse word for what a European count or duke was doing anyway. Same job, ruder haircut. It isn't true. A duke's title survived him. A Jarl's power had to be re-earned, continuously, by a living man, in front of people who were free to walk away from him and follow somebody else instead. Which is exactly what makes a figure like Hakon Sigurdsson worth pausing on. Hakon Jarl, as the sagas call him, came from the Jarls of Lade, a dynasty that had run the region around Trondheim for generations. By the year 975, he was the closest thing Norway had to a ruler, the commanding armies, controlling the north, dealing directly with kings in Denmark as something close to an equal. And here's the detail that should stop you for a second. He never took the title of king. Not once. In 20 years of running the country. He didn't need to. Jarl was already doing the job. If that surprised you as much as it surprised me the first time I read it, a man ruling an entire kingdom for 2 decades under a title that, in Frankish terms, would rank somewhere below a count, that's worth a like. It's the kind of specific, checkable detail that's the whole reason this channel exists. And it's exactly how YouTube knows to put this in front of more people who'd want to see it. Hold on to Hakon. We're coming back to him, and it will not be a flattering ending. So that's the Jarl system, on its own terms. Personal, earned, constantly renegotiated. This channel exists to pull systems like that apart in exactly this much detail. Not the Hollywood version, not the video game version. The one that actually holds up when you check it against the sources. If that's useful to you, subscribing means the next one finds you. Now flip to the other side of that riverbank, because Francia built something out of the same raw material, and it went in almost the opposite direction. Same raw material, a war band bound by personal loyalty, and Francia spent centuries turning it into something almost unrecognizable. Law. By the time Rollo knelt at Saint-Clair-sur-Epte, a Frankish vassal's obligations weren't a matter of reputation or memory. They were a ceremony, performed the same way every time. Homage first. The new vassal kneels, places his joined hands inside the lord's, and is formally received. Then fealty. A sworn oath, often taken on a relic or a Bible, binding the vassal before God as much as before his lord. And then investiture. The lord hands over some small object, a branch, a clod of earth, sometimes just a document, that stood in, legally, for the actual land being granted. That object is the whole point. It made the fief a thing that existed on paper, transferable, inheritable, arguable in front of a court, centuries after the 2 men who first shook hands over it were dead. That's the entire difference in one sentence, if you want it. A Jarl's authority lived in a relationship. A vassal's authority lived in a document. And the titles themselves prove it, if you trace where they actually came from, because duke and count aren't Germanic warband words dressed up in Latin. They're recycled Roman civil service. Dux was a Roman military governor's title, assigned to commanders overseeing a province's defense. Comes, count, meant a companion of the emperor's household, a trusted courtier or officer. When the empire's western half collapsed, the Frankish kings simply kept using Rome's old administrative furniture, propped it back up, and staffed it with their own men. A duke's title has a lineage running straight back to imperial bureaucracy. A jarl's title has a lineage running straight back to a runestone. These aren't 2 dialects of the same idea. They're 2 different ancestries that happen to end up doing adjacent jobs. Here's a smaller reveal that runs in the opposite direction, and it's one of my favorite details in this whole topic. The word knight started at the bottom. In Old English, snit just meant boy or servant, related to the German word for a bondsman. It's not until around 1100 that it starts meaning armed follower of a lord, and it takes until the 16th century before knight is unambiguously a rank of nobility. So while Jarl was drifting toward extinction at the top of Norse society, a title that would be phased out entirely by the 14th century, replaced by duke, knight was climbing the other direction, from household servant all the way up into the peerage. Same 3 or 4 centuries, completely opposite trajectories. Nobody plans that. It's just what happens when a warband culture gets formalized into paperwork over 500 years. And paperwork, it turns out, is durable in a way personal charisma never is. Remember Hakon Jarl? 20 years running Norway, never even bothering with the title of king. In 995, a dispute broke out with the people of his own home region, right as a rival claimant arrived to challenge him. And that was it. Not a battle, not a siege. His support simply evaporated, in what looks from the sources like a matter of weeks, and Hakon Jarl, who had commanded armies and negotiated with kings as an equal, ended up hiding in a pigsty on a farm called Rimul, where his own slave, a man named Tormod Kark, killed him. That is how fast Jarl power could disappear, because it was never a property right. It was a running vote of confidence, and the vote had just changed. A Frankish duke could be lazy, absent, even genuinely incompetent, and the title would generally survive him, because it wasn't attached to whether people liked him. It was attached to a document a court would enforce. I should say, honestly, that feudalism, as one tidy, empire-wide system, is not something every historian actually agrees exists. The classic picture, homage, fealty, fief, all fitting together as a single coherent structure, comes largely from historians like Mark Bloch. But a later historian, Susan Reynolds, went back to the primary sources and argued a lot of that neat structure was assembled after the fact, by later medieval lawyers and the scholars who studied them, layered onto a messier, more local reality. Historians are still genuinely split on how much of feudalism was ever one system at all, rather than a label we glued on afterward. And if you've got a theory about which side gets it more right, the comments are open. So go back to the riverbank. You now know exactly what was happening underneath that ritual. Rollo wasn't just annoyed at a foreign custom. He was a man from a system where power lived in a relationship, earned, visible, revocable, being asked to accept power as a document instead, fixed, legal, binding whether anyone liked him or not. Keeping his own man off his knees, making Charles do the bending instead, wasn't just pride. It was the last move available to someone from a warband culture, performed in the exact moment his whole world was being formally converted into someone else's paperwork. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. Rollo took the land, he took the baptism, and within roughly 100 years, his descendants, men raised entirely inside the feudal system their ancestor had been dragged into at the point of a treaty, had gone further with it than almost anyone else in Francia. Norman dukes built castles across their territory as a matter of routine administration, and organized knight service with a discipline historians still single out as unusually tight, even by Frankish standards. The grandsons of a man who wouldn't kiss a king's foot ended up running one of the most tightly organized feudal military machines in Western Europe. And in 1066, they used it to cross the Channel. Here's the detail that closes the loop, and it's the one I'd genuinely bring up at dinner. The men William of Normandy's knights conquered in England were, structurally and linguistically, Jarls. Godwin, Earl of Wessex, had been raised up by Canute the Great, a Danish king, in a system barely one generation removed from Scandinavian rule. An earl under Canute functioned almost exactly like a jarl back home, a king's regional strongman, not yet a feudal peer bound by homage and fief. Canute himself ran England on a genuine hybrid, a permanent bodyguard of housecarls, paid retainers funded by heavy royal taxation. That's neither quite the old gift hall loyalty of a Norwegian Jarl's Hall, nor quite a Frankish knight holding land in exchange for service. It's a third thing, a paid standing retinue, sitting exactly where you'd expect it to sit. Partway between a system built on personal generosity and one built on legal contract, on the very island where those two logics were about to collide outright. Godwin's son was Harold Godwinson, King of England in 1066, the man Duke William's knights killed at Hastings. Word for word, Jarl and Earl are the same title. And at Hastings, the fully feudalized descendants of a Viking chieftain rode down the not yet feudalized descendants of Viking earls, using precisely the system Rollo's own generation had been forced into at that riverbank a century and a half earlier. That's the kind of detail that's fun to bring up at dinner and watch someone's face change. The Normans conquered England with a system a Viking had to be humiliated into accepting, and used it against men who shared his exact title. It's tempting to read that as a straightforward lesson. The better system won, but that flattens something worth keeping. The Jarl system wasn't a failed prototype of feudalism. It was a genuinely different answer to the same problem. How do you convince armed men to follow you? Scandinavia's answer required you to keep earning it, in public, for as long as you wanted to keep it. Francia's answer let you stop earning it and start owning it instead. You can still see that exact fork today, if you look for it. Some organizations run almost entirely on one person's pull, a founder, a leader whose authority is really just the accumulated loyalty of people who chose to follow them, and who could, in theory, walk. Lose that person, and the whole structure can go the way Hakon Jarl did, fast, and without much warning. Other organizations are built the Frankish way, roles, contracts, ownership stakes, structures that keep functioning more or less on their own, no matter who currently occupies which office. Neither one is simply the advanced version of the other. They're two different bets on the same basic problem, made 1,000 years apart by people who never met. So, 3 things worth keeping from all of this. First, a Jarl was never a Norse duke. Same root word, entirely different machine. One running on personal loyalty renewed constantly in a hall and confirmed at a thing. The other running on a legal document a court would enforce long after the men who signed it were dead. Second, and this is the one that actually changes how you should read this whole period going forward. Language lies to you here. Jarl, Earl, Duke, Knight. The words survived, calmly, across centuries, while the actual systems underneath them mutated, collided, and in Rollo's case, got forced to convert. Every time you hit one of those titles in a saga, a chronicle, or a subtitle, it's worth a half-second of suspicion. Ask which system you're actually looking at, not just which word got used. Third, and this is the one I keep coming back to, a man who wouldn't kneel all the way ended up founding a dynasty that knelt more completely, more efficiently, than almost anyone else in Western Europe, and used exactly that to beat men who carried his own original title. There's something close to tragic in that, if you sit with it. The thing Rollo refused to fully surrender at that riverbank is the thing his own descendants ended up mastering so completely, it erased what he'd been. If you'd been born into this world, not as a king, not as a chronicler's favorite, just an ordinary free man with a decent sword arm, which system do you think you'd actually have thrived under? The hall, where you earn your place every season, or the court, where you sign for it once and it's yours for life? Tell me below, and be honest about which one you'd actually survive, not just which one sounds better. Rollo never did learn to kneel all the way. His grandsons did it for him, so thoroughly that within 150 years, it conquered a kingdom.